Hi, I'm John Pasalis, and this is the Move Smartly Show. This week, we return to our regular series that we call The Situation, where I answer questions that we get every month about people's own personal real estate situations. This month, our Move Smartly editor, Urmi Desai, is a little bit under the weather, but she agreed to join me so that you don't have to sit here and listen to a monologue of me asking the questions and answering them myself. So thank you for Urmi for joining. And now we're going to kick it off on with this week's show. So Urmi, thank you for joining our show this week.
All right, no problem. I wanted to say excuse me for my voice. You can hear it a little bit as I'm a bit under the weather. We got this question as an email to editor@movesmartly.com. Hi there. My family was having a debate about whether or not to use a neighbor as a listing agent for a home my elderly parents are putting on the market. We would love the host to weigh in on the risks of having the neighbor be in that position. Thanks for a wonderful podcast. We love it. Thanks, Trisha.
All right. A great question. Listen, I don't want to say that there's any specific risks of having a neighbor. I mean, who the heck? I don't know who their neighbor is. But I think more broadly, I think the key thing is I don't think people should just use the neighbor because it's the neighbor or use the friend because it's a friend. Listen, I think it's a challenge. I think realtors are a funny bunch where they feel like if they know someone who's buying a home, they're entitled to that person's business simply because they exist and they have this acquaintance. And listen, I think if you're a consumer, I don't know if I would fall into that trap. I mean, that's the realtor's problem, quite frankly. If you open up a business, is your realtor friend go out and gonna, basically kind of give you business every week and purchase your goods? I mean, probably not. It's a ridiculous assumption I think that some real estate agents have. They just assume they're getting the business. So, my advice, whether it's the neighbor or a friend or someone, is I think people should always be interviewing. Um, Interview three people, and even if it's a family member, like I think it's important to make it clear other real estate agents. You're interviewing a few to see who's going to be the best fit because some agents are just going to offer different services than others. Do you know what I mean? Depending on what you want for the home. Some realtors are really just going to slap up a sign and take some pictures, in some cases with their iPhones. Just terrible service. Other agents will invest money to paint and fix and stage and style a home to try to get a better price. So, I think what matters are the services you're getting and also the advice and the strategy and the pricing strategy and all of the other things that, the softer skills are also important. So, again, I think it's important to interview three people and then basically decide who you think is the best fit. I think it's a terrible strategy to just use the neighbor just because they're the neighbor or use the friend just because they're a friend because you need a way of evaluating what they do and what their skills are. Just because they went to the real estate college for a few months and got a realtor's license, I mean, it doesn't mean they're great at what they do. I mean, there's tens of thousands of real estate agents in the GTA. The vast majority do very few to no deals. It's a handful that actually do quite a few transactions. And of course, the busier you are, the more experience you have. So I would not assume just because that they're a real estate agent that they're good at what they do or they're going to provide the right level of service. So I think it's always best to interview. If they're a friend or a neighbor, you can at least say you gave them an opportunity. And listen, if they didn't win the listing, for example, well, that's their fault. It's not yours. You at least gave them the opportunity to, convince you to work with them. And if someone else did a better job of selling their skills and their service, then that's just part of the business. So that's how I would approach it personally.
And I just have a follow-up to Trisha's question myself. In this case, would you say that, let's say the neighbor then would have some knowledge about the neighborhood. So if they are the one selling the home, they would have that advantage in a sense of knowing the neighborhood, and the amenities around it, schools and other things. Would you say that is more or less important than, again, what you were talking about is the experience of the agent? How many sales do they do? How many times do they represent as a listing agent a year? Like, what would you say is more important?
Yeah, I would, for the most part, not say neighborhood knowledge, which might sound counterintuitive. Like, provided the agent knows the areas and works the areas, like you don't have to have lived in a specific pocket for 30 years to know how to market the home. Like at the end of the day, um, there are certain features, like you said, school districts, whatever, that most good agents are going to highlight. The reality is that's a few things that you're putting in the marketing. Most of the sales, like most of the kind of the promotion are done by the buying agents. Like in the GTA, like the vast majority of homes, the buyers are represented by their own agents, right? So the listing agent, is only really kind of their neighborhood knowledge is coming off in the listing and in those details. Now, where I'll say, you know, even though I said neighborhood knowledge is not critical, you got to take that with a grain of salt. Like I would never represent someone in an area that I know nothing about, right? Um, so you also don't want a real estate agent who just doesn't sell in your market, right? Because again, they just don't have the expertise. They don't know the comparables as well. Whereas if they're active in, certain region in the GTA, odds are, especially if they're a busy agent, they've sold homes in most areas, so they know a lot about each area. So yeah, you don't necessarily need someone who specializes on a certain pocket of a neighborhood, but you also don't want to hire someone who's, based in Muskoka and doesn't sell homes in Mississauga or Toronto or wherever your house is.
And a final question for you. I have heard anecdotally about problems, for example, when a seller
Mhm.
really wants to be there for every open house and kind of talks a lot to potential buyers and even turns them off, like depending on their
Yeah.
personality. And I was just thinking, and I don't know if I'm being a bit silly here, but if the neighbor is actually the next door neighbor and is the agent, and there's something about them that is a little bit challenging, have you ever heard of such a thing, like something like that, putting off potential buyers?
I mean, that's a good question. The neighbor turning off is a unique one I can't say I've heard of, but certainly the seller wanting to be there for every showing and to talk about their house. I mean, this is the thing. I think some sellers think this is the best thing ever because no one knows their house like them. But from my experience, like 95% of buyers or 98% don't want a personal guided tour and a detailed description of every finish and detail that they hand selected when they built a home. You know what I mean? I think the seller who really loves their home and really invested a lot of time and thought thinks everyone wants to know why they picked certain things and why they picked that light fixture and why they picked that baseboard. I mean, but some of this is just a bit too much information. I think there are other ways to convey the key details. I mean, and certainly after a buyer buys a home, they like to meet the seller to understand, some of these details. But generally, it's not great when the seller's there walking people through. People want some space to be able to talk about their home privately, or the home that they're viewing privately without the seller following them around and listening and paying attention. So it's generally a bad strategy to do that.
All right. Well, thank you, Tricia, for your question, and hopefully that response gave you some food for thought. Let's move on now to our second question. Hi, John. I just saw your video regarding whether Toronto's housing market is in a bubble or not. Leaving the technical definition of a bubble aside, Toronto's housing market looks very overvalued. Average households can't afford these prices. It looks like prices have been driven up by debt. And isn't it normal for debt bubbles to burst so that asset
Hmm,
prices can normalize? And if not, how on earth can home prices stay this high? Thanks, Mark.
that's a good question. So, and it's a challenging one. So, I mean, are home prices high in the Toronto area? 100%. Are they above market value? I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer because there are a lot of factors that impact value. So I'll try to answer just to explain a few things because I'm not trying to make a thesis explaining the prices today are rational, right? But listen, I've been in this business for a long time, and even when I bought my home in the early 2000s, everything I heard about was that we're in a bubble. So the bubble narrative has really not gone away. Like we've had this talk and this concern about Toronto's housing market being a bubble. For those of us who've been around for a long time, will remember, Garth Turner, who's like a financial advisor, I guess, wrote a book about the bubble bursting back in, I don't know, 2005, 2006, and it's going to be a disaster. Don't buy a home. And back then, home prices were 4.5 times income ish. Now they're 9.5 times income. So the narrative has been around for a long time. So and I've met many buyers who didn't buy because of that, because their own analysis told them that this is irrational and it's a debt bubble that's going to burst. Okay. So I'm not going to try to convince anyone. If that's what someone's thesis is, I think that's fine. I think I'll just try to explain why I'm not as convinced by this, this idea that we're going to have the type of collapse that we saw, for example, in the Toronto market in the 90s when prices plummeted and, they stayed low for years and years. So when we think about, there are a lot of factors that can leads to prices being elevated, right? There's a great paper called Superstar Cities that kind of touches on one. And, one of the ideas in this is an academic paper is that when we have these global cities, and Toronto is becoming like a global city, it is a global city that attract a lot of people, which obviously we know we do. So their population's booming and the supply of housing is constrained. What ends up happening is like this filtering process. The people who end up buying end up being disproportionately wealthier, right? So you have wealthier households basically kind of crowding out lower income households. And this contributes to a higher price to income ratio because price to incomes are looked at medians prices. And this is generally what's happening. Like a lot of people we see, there's this exodus outside of Toronto, outside of Ontario, people fleeing to other markets, right? And I think that's actually another important point is that this is not a Toronto problem. The high house prices and lack of affordability is a national issue, right? That has, so the factors are much bigger than these local dynamics, which is very different. When the US housing bubble happened, it was very regional, right? It was certain states that were the bubble states, California, Arizona, Florida. Anyways, like the Nevada, like a few of them in the southern United States that were the bubble states. But a lot of other regions, actually, when prices collapsed, did not collapse because they didn't see a rapid increase in prices. Whereas in Canada, we're seeing price pressures nationally, which means there's something bigger going on. And of course, we all know our population is growing by 3% per year. We're not building any more houses. And people are going to say, well, it's mainly students. Students aren't buying homes, right? Which is 100% true. But they still need a place to live. And where are they living? Well, many of them are living in rooming houses in the suburbs that were bought by investors that converted them to rooming houses for students. So when you have thousands of investors buying suburban homes, converting them to rooming houses, well, what does that do? It means there's actually fewer homes available to be purchased by families, right? And one of the side effects of that, and we've been seeing it for 10 years, is actually a declining home ownership rate, right? And the home ownership rate is actually declining, not because we've built so many rentals over the past 10 years. It's because many of the single family homes that normally would have been available for families to buy are converted to rental properties, are no longer available. So the stock of homes that households can even purchase is smaller, right? So what ends up happening? Like I said earlier, it's like the higher income households and the households with more capital end up buying, right? So that's why we're seeing bigger down payments from families, to their kids. We're seeing like almost effectively early inheritance. And that has been a big factor. And while there's certainly a narrative that it's a debt-driven market, I mean, household debt relative to income in Canada is quite high if we look at it compared to international levels. The fact is that when we look at loan to value ratios, which is basically how much debt people take on relative to the price of the home when they're purchasing, they've actually been declining over the past 10 years. And this is on the Bank of Canada's website. They track this for every type of investor, I'm pretty sure. For sure, like investors, which are the biggest number, big growing number, it's been declining. And that means people are putting down more capital, right? So unlike the US, where you had people who had no income buying 6, 7, 8 properties, the investors in Canada tend to be more well capitalized. They have more equity. They're putting more cash down. So yes, there's a lot of debt, but it's not as, I'd say, as speculative. And the last thing I'll say is that like the role of housing has changed. I mean, this idea that, and what I mean by that, like, is, when my parents bought a home 30, well, more than 30, 40 years ago, I'm being generous. It was a long time ago, in the, whatever it is, in the 70s or something like that. Back then, a home was primarily a shelter for a family and a long-term kind of investment, but a long-term for a family to use for their retirement, all of these types of things, right? And the market has shifted quite a bit. Housing today is a financial asset, right? It is not just a home for families. And what I mean by a financial asset is you have wealthy households buying more and more and accumulating houses strictly for investment, like I talked about in the suburbs buying rentals. You also have Bay Street firms raising tons of money to buy homes. Like, and while we are talking about homes are unaffordable for families, Bay Street Corps are putting out prospectuses and reports talking about why homes in Southern Ontario are actually cheap, right? Because the way they're valuing them is against multi-unit housing, which they see is more expensive, and they see more financial potential in buying up low-rise homes, okay? So while we're talking about homes are too high because we can't afford them based on our own income, the corps are going out and saying, houses are a deal in Southern Ontario, and we need to raise a ton of money to go out and buy them because they're a great investment, right? So, of course, what's going to drive and what's going to kind of be the constraint on home prices? It's not our incomes, because the corporations are willing to pay a lot more than the average household, right? So how do people end up buying when homes are this expensive? Like I said, I mean, you just end up with the wealthier households buying, people getting bigger down payments. And listen, I'm not trying to justify it. I think all of these trends are actually incredibly problematic, and I've talked about them on this show, on Twitter. This is what we call the financialization of housing. Like, if you look at kind of the literature, it's when economies basically shift from using homes as primarily like using it as a social right for shelter and converting it to a financial asset for the wealthiest, right? And this is kind of a big shift that we have seen in Canada. So of course, when these dynamics change, the anchors, this idea of what is affordable is different, because what's affordable, market prices are set by who's willing to pay the most, right? And who's willing to pay the most is not the households, it's the people with the most capital. So that's a very long-winded answer. And again, this is not a thesis about why prices will go up forever. This is not a thesis on they're not going to collapse. Everything is possible, 100%. If we see a massive decline in our population growth, if governments restrict capital to investors, all of these things can flip the whole market on its head, right? But the way the market's going now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen unless we see big changes. So that's my long-winded answer. I mean, the last thing I'll say is, again, because I've seen a lot of people um, make their decisions based on their analysis of the market, which, I mean, I'm always reluctant to do because, you know, there's this vulnerability where you have like analysis paralysis, right? And, I'll never forget one of the first properties I was looking at buying when I had to take over my parents' business. My dad got MS when I was quite young and he couldn't do it anymore. And, I'm sitting there with my spreadsheets. I'm like, university, I'm, looking at discounted cash flows, doing all this math. And, my brother, my dad walks into the room and he's like looking at me poring over spreadsheets. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, this cap rate, and I think it should be a little bit better and all this, I think I'm so smart, right? And he basically says to me, he's like, let me ask you something. He's like, does the rent cover the expenses and the mortgage? I'm like, yeah. It's like, do you like the neighborhood? I'm like, yeah, it's a good area. He's like, then buy the stupid property. Like, and close this shit up, basically, right? And his point was like, stop analyzing it. You're gonna worry about it. Like you have to kind of get back to the basics, right? And as a home buyer, I mean, I think the equivalent is if you're buying a home for 1 or 2 years, yeah, you should be worried. If you're buying a home for the next 10 to 15 years for your family, I mean, you have a tough decision to make. You're either gonna just whatever, at some points, I'm gonna buy a home. It seems irrational, but I'm gonna be here for 15 years. Or you're gonna just say, I'm waiting because this is irrational. And I've seen a lot of people do that. And if you do that, I think you just have to be comfortable with this idea that, you might get priced out. Like the people I know who did that in 2017 or 2018, it's a lot harder to jump in now because they regret not paying what seemed like an irrational price then, but it was based on their thesis that the market would collapse. So I think you just have to be prepared for your thesis not working out. And if it does, all the power to you. And again, I don't know. I don't make decisions like that personally. Like I think, like I said in my other video, like I think it's important to hit pause when you see vulnerabilities in the short term, but try to rationalize the long term is a tough game. But again, if someone wants to drive their decisions that way, I mean, it's again, all the power to them. I think it's people's money, people's homes. They should do whatever works for them.
All right. Well, thank you. And to recap, I understand the writer Mark's question and frustration and confusion completely because the base question carries as an assumption that traditionally, like you were saying, the use of homes was for end users to be in them. So
Mhm.
if you hear that average home prices are now nine times income,
Income.
you make the assumption that that gap is made by debt.
Yeah.
But what you're showing and telling us is, and this chimes with three big metrics we've seen recently. One is StatsCan starting to track the amount of investor activity in the Canadian market. It is at 30% of homes are
Mhm.
owned by investors.
Mhm.
So again, investors tend to be more capitalized than
Mhm.
just an end user using their salary to cover what they can buy. So
Mhm.
that's one answer for how that disconnect happens, right? The
Mhm.
second answer is immigration as a source of our population boom. People talk about students, but John, permanent migration is also up,
You're
right?
right.
Our
Yeah.
permanent numbers are up to 500 a year. 500,000 a year. And it makes sense to me that a mid-aged, early middle-aged person would come to Canada more capitalized
Mhm.
than other people. Like when you're
Mhm.
shifting countries, you
For
might be
sure.
selling up a property or having family help you do that to resettle in a new country.
Mhm.
So I would think some source of capitalization is coming in
Mhm.
with that type of population boom. So we have
Mhm.
a particular type of population boom, which is
Mhm.
based on immigration,
Yeah.
right? We don't have, um, and then uh, and then the other trend is the Canadians that have already done well with their home prices. So
Yeah.
we're forgetting that a lot of parents are in the position to use their paid off homes to turn out and help their kids, giving them huge down payments. So that's
Yeah.
another way that capitalization is higher than you would
Hmm.
expect, right? Of
Yeah.
an individual. So, um, and I guess the fourth thing I'm thinking about, John, is you said this is a national problem, but
Mhm.
there's a bit of a domino effect, right? Like
Mhm.
as the buyers in the Toronto area
Yeah.
get crowded, they then go out to outlying areas where they
Hmm.
take their Toronto incomes and capital and
Yeah.
start crunching
Yeah.
people in other markets,
Yeah.
right? So
Exactly.
we're seeing people in the East Coast,
Mhm.
Nova Scotia suffer when a lot of
Mhm.
Ontarians move down there, and
Mhm.
and some effects from BC residents going to Calgary,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
So, if I'm correct, the answer to Mark's question is while this disconnect looks like it's built on a house of cards, there's some underlying factors uh,
Yeah.
for why that disconnect's happening. So we would have to
100%.
see all of these factors move
Yeah.
in substantial ways to see, those prices really shift or come back down to
Yeah.
their times income ratio.
Yeah.
And
100%. Yeah.
yeah, and that's something that you are saying what we're seeing in Canada with this trends of financialization of housing is actually going the opposite way.
It is going the opposite way.
Yeah.
And again, and you actually made a good point that I forgot to mention. Like it was like, thank you for that. It's a good overview of what I said. But your one point that you made that I think is important to highlight is this idea that households, when anyone's buying a home, debt is effectively capped at Canada at about 4 to 4.5 times a household's income, which means the most you can borrow as a mortgage is at most about 4.5 times your income, right? So go and fine. Some people are going to private lenders and getting some, questionable debt, paying 12% per year. That's going to happen. That's not the majority. I mean, most mortgages are out with big banks in Canada, and they have underwriting guidelines. So, if you could only borrow, say, up to 4.5 times your income, and the median house price in Toronto now, I think, is like 9.5 times income. Well, how are people affording it? And that's exactly the point I mentioned. You raised it. It's capital. Like people are coming with more money. Investors are coming with more money. Corporations are not constrained by income. They're raising like hundreds of $millions on Bay Street and just buying them with 50% down to have a certain debt coverage ratio. They're not constrained by income. So yeah, I think these are massive problems. And again, like I said, I'm not arguing that it's going to keep going on, but the path we're going is not good. And you're right. I agree with you. Like we're not going in a direction where we're moving towards affordability. We're moving, and the policies are all moving in a direction where things might be less affordable. And whether that's like prices rising or rents rising, it's not great. And for the record, I don't expect prices to rise very much when rates are 5%. But again, the affordability, if prices aren't rising, rents are going to be challenged. So there's a lot of underlying issues in Canada, I'd say.
All right. Well, Mark, hopefully that helps. And I think for all of us, maybe these are the things that we should be thinking about when we are going to ballot boxes or agitating. I
Hmm.
think there's even a larger takeaway we can take from this is not only consumers, but citizens.
Hmm.
If we do want to see some changes, these are the areas in which we're going to need to see government start acting.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we're not going to see that ratio getting blown out of the water, that trend
Hmm.
stopping anytime
Yeah.
soon, right? It's just getting
Hmm.
larger and larger, the times income ratio. Okay, thank you for that, John. Now, our final question
Hmm.
is from Steve. Hi, John. I think your data analysis is very insightful and your YouTube channel is very informative. So please keep that going. I'm just curious as a condo investor, could you show a deep analysis on the percentage of foreign students and where they are housed? You mentioned they are in rooming houses, but what about all the condos downtown? Who are the main renters of one-bedroom condos downtown? Thanking you, Steve.
Mm. Okay, I don't know if we have time for a deep analysis, but the vast majority of international students, and in particular the growth we've seen, have been not in downtown Toronto. They've been either like in the outer suburbs or outside of the GTA, more specifically. And we'll include a link maybe in the show notes. The CBC had a very good article showing the schools that are that have seen the biggest increase in international students. Now, the vast majority of these students are not super wealthy, right? Many of them are constrained by household income and the income that they're getting from their parents from their home countries, and are looking for very affordable rentals, which is why many people in the suburbs have converted homes to rooming houses that they are basically, charging 6, 7, 800 bucks a student, and maybe two or three people share a bedroom, in an apartment or in a basement apartment, and they're just like, 15 students living in a home rather than one family. Um, so that's the dominant trend. I mean, do students live in condos downtown? I mean, you may get some. I mean, I don't want to say it's not. Like, certainly, I mean, if we think about downtown, yeah, sure, schools like U of T, TMU, like, are they getting some international students that are more affluent, that where, two friends can share an apartment? 100%. I would say that that is not the dominant demographic. I mean, the dominant demographic are just people who, need an apartment, who maybe they're recent grads who, are working downtown and need an apartment. Toronto, the GTA has not built purpose-built rentals in like 40 years. Our entire rental housing stock, any increase over the past 20 years, has largely been from condos that have been being used as rentals. Um, and that's because the government didn't really prioritize building permanent rental housing. So that gap is filled by the private sector, of sort of mom and pop investors. So the dominant tenant is just someone who has a downtown job, who, needs a place to live. So it's not, I'd say for the most part, it is not students who are renting condominiums. Most students just don't have the income to afford, what's a one-bedroom condo? You're spending like mid $2,000 a month. I mean, who can afford that, right? With tuition, with everything else, with their spending money, it's a lot for a student to pay. Um, Again, you might see it on the margins, but that's not the dominant renter downtown.
So anecdotally, John, I did go to U of T downtown campus. I believe you did too. I do remember even then, many of my friends, I don't want to say many, but enough that it wasn't just a one-off, where parents were buying the condos around the
Hmm.
campuses as an investment and having their kids live in it. And then
Yeah.
eventually when their kids would finish school, they would retain it as
Hmm.
an investment condo. So I do wonder if that is a longer standing trend actually, and doesn't just entail foreign students. So that's
Hmm.
one thing to think about
Yeah.
around U of T and Toronto Met University. And I'm understanding that that is still a massive worry
Hmm.
from my friends whose kids are now entering university
Hmm.
age, as numbers on campus have exploded and on campus residences are unheard of.
Hmm.
So a lot of people, apparently there's a booming business I didn't realize in owner operators running kind of like student dorms.
Hmm.
I did not realize that around
Yeah.
Yonge and Carlton. So a
Yeah.
lot of companies have decided to buy these buildings and operate them as sort of rentals for students. So
Hmm.
um, I think that's one thing we need to consider, is where is the location of these one bedroom condos. My
Hmm.
other observation, John, and I'm wondering what you think about this, is in my own experience where I live, there are many household formation things to consider. A lot of, unfortunately, separations, divorces. We have single person households
Hmm.
that I suspect are a growing number
Yeah.
for a number of reasons. So either people delaying marriage and family
Hmm.
formation for career reasons, or
Hmm.
maybe because of even expensive real estate reasons. So
Hmm.
I suspect these are also other groups of renters that
Yeah.
as Toronto skyline has built up,
Hmm.
maybe we're seeing more of these types of residents in these one bedroom condos. I wonder what you think about that, John.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's the other key driver of it. And certainly one person household or just two people is like the dominant trend downtown that we're seeing. So
Yeah, actually, I do my research very seriously on housing, and I was reading about that reality show, Love is Blind.
Is that how you do your research?
In the Guardian, the UK Guardian, and the columnist had such a funny take because she was saying that all the different Love Is Blind shows around the world have given her an insight into housing markets,
Get out of
and
here.
she pointed out that Sweden is a country in which single person households is the highest type of household,
Interesting.
over 50%.
Wow.
That is
Is
crazy.
that?
Yes, and there was a brief mention about the fact that the Swedish government has long built purpose-built rentals, and
Yeah.
they're affordable,
Mhm.
and they're plentiful. However, the waiting list for them is so long that I was joking if this was a reverse effect where even if you meet Mr. or Mrs. Right, do
Yeah.
you really abandon your condo or
Oh,
apartment and move in with them, or do you just conduct your entire relationship as a two
that's hilarious.
apartment family?
Is that what they said might be one of the drivers of it?
Well, she pointed to some links. It was just
I
a bit
see.
of a fun column, so I looked into it.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of speculating that where you have that dynamic, I wonder if that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
'Cause, that's one thing we even learned in the US housing market bubble, the 2008. These things sound funny, but
Hmm.
at the base of a lot of housing booms and phenomenons are these real life trends.
100%. Yeah.
Right. And so we saw in the Big Short how people are going out to these Arizona and Nevada
Mhm.
and seeing what was going on the
Mhm.
ground. So
Yeah.
that kind of just made me think, maybe I could imagine that being like, well,
Oh,
who's going to
yeah.
give up their rent controlled apartment? Not me.
That's actually hilarious. It's that you don't think about this, but that's actually like, in theory, government policies and making rentals affordable is a good thing
Yes.
until you have an 8-year wait list
Yeah.
and no one wants to freaking give them up, even
Yeah.
if they're in a relationship, which is actually kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Um,
'Cause Love is blind for a while. And then it ends, and then now you don't have your condo. Anyway, I'm speculating, but the question that Steve was asking led me to think a little bit of the dynamics I'm seeing around me in
Mhm,
Toronto,
mhm,
living as part of one of that one bedroom, like a condo community. I observe that it's not just young people, like couples waiting to
mhm,
get their first property, which there are a lot of people in that bucket.
mhm,
But there is these other two groups I'm seeing too, where a
mhm,
lot more single person households,
mhm.
and that must be a growing trend and a growing number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you for your Love is Blind take. I think it's actually quite interesting. Um,
Yeah,
and
so stay my cold has not slowed me down. Scintillating research from the world of reality TV. Keep tuned to Move Smartly.
I love it. Well, thank you all for your questions again this month. We really enjoyed them. As always, please keep them coming. Send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com. If you have more specific questions and want to meet up, you can click the link in the show notes or just go to movesmartly.com/meet John. Until next time, thank you again, and thank you, Urmi, for joining us, even though you're a little bit under the weather this week.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.